안녕하십니까. 왈가왈북의 유영호입니다. 저희 왈가왈북이 시작한 지 1년이 약간 넘었습니다. 그동안 많이 성원해주고 후원해주신 그 구독자 여러분들께 감사드리면서 저희 왈가왈북을 좀 더 확장시키는 서비스의 하나로서 해외 석학들과 인터뷰하는 그 꼭지를 마련했습니다. 그동안은 저희 왈가왈북이 이제 김연희, 홍광철 두 분을 모시고 북녘에 대한 가짜뉴스를 바로잡고 북에 대해서 우리가 잘 몰랐거나 오해하고 있는 부분들에 대해서 주로 이야기를 했습니다. 하지만 좀 더 이제 왈가왈북을 해외에 알리고 좀 더 그 지평을 넓혀나가고자 하기 위해서 그 첫 번째로 미국 예일대학교 정치학교 교수이시고 그 정치학계에서는 상당한 거두이신 이언 사피로 교수님을 모시고 인터뷰를 진행하였습니다. 그런데 참고로 제가 좀 안타깝게도 영어 실력이 이렇게 인터뷰를 진행할 만큼 높질 못해갖고 저희 왈가왈북을 항상 응원해주고 지지해주시는 박연진 선생님께서 대신해서 그 사피로 교수님과 인터뷰를 진행하도록 하였습니다. 그러면 자, 박연진 선생님과 이언 사피로 교수님의 인터뷰를 보도록 하겠습니다.
Hi, I am Yeonjin Park, a graduate student of Dongguk University, Seoul in Korea. We have Professor Great Ian Sapiro at Yale University here. Good morning, Professor. It is a big honor to have you here.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And first, I'd like to introduce our show, 왈가왈북. In South Korea, we can easily hear many fake news about North Korea right now. Even some intellectuals, medias, and politicians accept those fake news without any questions. So sad to say, not a few Koreans demonize North Korea because of those fake news and some propagators. And we believe this is kind of bad for both South and North in terms of peace. So we have one of our media program here called 왈가왈북. They are checking those fake news and correct them. And that they could somehow contribute to the peace of Korea, to the peace of Korean Peninsula. Okay, then your two books, Professor, The Flight from Reality in Human Science and The Moral Foundation of Politics has been translated in South Korea. So I like to ask some questions related. So,
Sure.
Yeah, Professor. So let's start with The Flight from Reality in Human Science. First, actually, this is kind of hard to believe. The human science we are studying is the flight from reality. Could you please briefly share the main idea of this book?
So many times academics are more interested in their methods and in their models than in understanding problems in the world. And so they pay very little attention to what's actually going on, and instead they develop ever more complicated theories with lots of jargon that prevents people from understanding what they're doing, but actually shine very little light on the world.
Okay, then I think North Korea study is a good example. In South Korea and the US, there are many North Korean studies. But most of them are just stuck with method-driven, never have done problem-driven, which you emphasize on your book. So others just laugh at them like their North Korean study is like international detective novels. So, and that word, North Korean expert itself is kind of oxymoron. And advise that you have to be doubtful if they are saying that they are expert of North Korea. So what can you say about this conventional North Korean study in the US?
Well, I'm not an expert on North Korea, I should say. I think the most difficult problem in studying North Korea is probably two. One, it's very difficult to get reliable evidence because it's difficult for people to come and go. And the second is that almost everyone who talks about North Korea has some kind of political agenda. And so because of that, they may obscure what's going on or make up what they think is going on, but not actually know what's going on. And it's very, very difficult to get reliable evidence about what's going on there, as was the case with the old Soviet Union, for example, or China today.
You also said fake news or bullshit politically in danger. Could you tell us more about the danger of fake news or bullshit you mentioned?
Well, 30 or 40 years ago, pretty much everybody watched the same news. There were, say in the US, there were 3 news channels, NBC, CBS, and ABC. And many different points of view were presented on the news. People had arguments from the left, from the right, from local perspectives, from international perspectives. They all clashed. And that was what we call the competition of ideas. And that was one of the ways in which the truth would come out from the clash of different opinions. Since that time, first we got cable TV, then we got satellite TV, then we got modern social media. And so now we live in a world in which people just talk to people like themselves. Everybody talks to people who share their own beliefs. And so we know from work in the social sciences that if you just talk to people like yourself, you become reinforced in your beliefs and you become more extreme. And so now, instead of a marketplace of ideas where different opinions clash and people have to defend themselves, people just talk to people exactly like themselves and become confirmed in their own opinions. Everybody lives in their own separate silos. So, people on the left watch certain TV channels, people on the right watch different ones. They talk to people just like themselves on social media, and everybody becomes reinforced in their own perceptions without confronting other views of the world that would maybe make them uncomfortable, and without subjecting their own beliefs to critical scrutiny. So I think we've moved from a marketplace of ideas to these separate silos where people just mutually reinforce their prior convictions.
You know that the Korean Peninsula is one of the places with the highest war risk. But in South Korea and the US, there are lots of fake news about North Korea going around. Actually, we have noticed that most of fake news has been produced by North Korean defectors. By the way, we don't really know why US government financially support them. And we just suspect that US government probably use them as a tool of the regime change against North Korea. What is your opinion for this?
I'm skeptical of that because I think that the US government policy toward North Korea under Trump is so completely incoherent and without any purpose that I doubt that they have any strategy at all. I think Donald Trump is a very unstable man who goes with impulses and instincts, and he really believed that he could make friends with Kim Jong-un and then solve the whole problem. But really, he has absolutely no idea how to conduct negotiations. And so I think, I don't think there is any coherent US strategy about North Korea. This is why John Bolton went back. He thought he could impose his, I don't agree with Bolton at all, but he thought he could impose his strategy on Trump, and it didn't work.
And more serious thing is UN's sanction against North Korea is just based on testimony of North Korean defectors. But the problem is most of their testimony are not based on the truth. So with your perspective, how do you see the UN's action?
Well, I think that has a long history that really goes back at least to the 1990s. You know, in the 1990s, the Clinton administration in the US was negotiating with the North Koreans arms reduction. They were, basically their philosophy was to give incentives for North Korea to not develop nuclear capability. And the deal was that the US was giving heavy fuel oil to North Korea, and in return for that, the North Koreans were not producing nuclear weapons. And that was the status quo in the Clinton administration. When George W. Bush came in 2000, John Bolton was his North Korea person. And I think John Bolton was a very foolish man. And he said, no more negotiating. We're going to put sanctions. This is when the sanctions started. We're going to put sanctions on North Korea. We're not going to give them any fuel oil. And so the North Koreans began ramping up their nuclear. And that's in the first, you know, 2000 to 2004 is when the North Korean nuclear program really took off. And I think it was a failure of American diplomacy, was short-sighted, was John Bolton's fault. And then in the second Bush administration, 2004 to 2008, they realized, the Bush people realized that they had, that the sanctions were not working, and the North Korean nuclear capability was being built up. So they brought in Christopher Hill to do the five-party talks, to lead the five-party talks. And they got back to something like what had occurred in the Clinton administration years. The North Koreans decommissioned their nuclear capacity. They stopped, and the US again was giving them fuel oil. And that's what happened through the end of the Bush administration and into the Obama administration. But the North Koreans refused to give up their nuclear fuel because they saw it as their only insurance. You know, they saw how countries like India and Pakistan were treated differently once they had nuclear capacity. So it was impossible to get very far, and nothing much happened. And then when the Trump administration came back in, they ramped up the sanctions again, and we've got to a very bad situation. So I don't know how much of it is to do with the testimony of defectors. Personally, I think it has more to do with the changing ideologies of different American negotiators as Clinton and then Bush and Obama and now Trump have been in charge. They live in their own bubble, I think, to a very high degree, especially the Trump administration. They live in their own bubble. And so I don't know how much the defectors make any difference.
As a guest interviewer, I'd like to give you one suggestion. I believe that the untruthful testimony of defectors should not be consumed by the US government and media. And also, they should not be invited to the White House or Congress, because the first testimony will not be served to the benefit of the US. I'm not asking you to see North Korea favorably. I ask you to see North Korea as it is. And then would require to visit and watch the reality of this country. If you are not available to visit this country, this YouTube show, 왈가왈북, could be a good alternative. There are still many defectors who are willing to tell you the truth. If the US is really genuinely concerned about the human rights in North Korea, they should pay attention to their stories because they provide you with a good chance to compare the true and false stories. I sincerely ask for you and your university's kind attention to them. What do you think about this, Professor?
Well, I don't think we should ever refuse to listen to anyone. I think it's a mistake to try and censor what anybody says. So I wouldn't say we shouldn't listen to defectors, but I think you should always try to find multiple sources of evidence. So you want to cross-check what they say against what other people say, what you're learning from intelligence, what you're learning from satellites, imagery, what you're learning from as many sources as you can. So it's always naive to believe one, from evidence from one source. You always want to look at multiple sources.
Oh, and 왈가왈북 is doing many things. Of course, they cannot correct every fake news about North Korea, but as much as they can, they do their job in this field. Could you kindly give them some encouraging words and share your thoughts about their activities?
I'm not in a position to, because I don't really know much about what they do. So I'm, as I said, I'm not an expert on North Korea. I know, I look at it from the angle of what motivates the US to do what they do, and it mostly has to do with American domestic politics. It doesn't really, it's very much driven by what's going on here, not by what's going on there.
Okay, thank you. And your second book, The Moral Foundation of Politics, regarding, next one. I have learned that in politics, legitimacy is very important while I studying Max Weber. And I believe legitimacy is related with healthiness of political system. I think this book, The Moral Foundation of Politics, is also considering the issue of legitimacy. Could you please briefly introduce us key topic of this book?
Well, that is a book of political philosophy that looks at the different foundations of legitimacy in the Western tradition over the last 4 centuries. So the main Enlightenment theories of democracy, utilitarianism, the social contract, Marxism, and then more traditionalist views that go back to people like Burke. But the main argument of the book is that the best source of legitimacy is competitive democratic politics. For reasons connected to what I talked about earlier, that you really need competition over ideas. You really need competition over policies. And so if you have, if you have political parties that have to argue with each other in order to get elected and have competition over what policies are going to be enacted, you're more likely to get good policies and you're more likely to get legitimate government than if you have a single party in charge of a country, let's say. So to bring it back to what you were talking about before, while of course you should be skeptical of what defectors say, we should also be skeptical of what the North Korean regime says, because then they don't face political competition. They're not held to account by anybody for what they do. And so it's not a regime that one would expect to have a lot of legitimacy.
And we have issue here. It may be one of example verifying healthiness of democracy in South Korea. Kim Yanghee, she is the main cast of 왈가왈북. 9 years ago, she was tricked by a defector broker and brought to South Korea. From the first day, she has kept on asking South Korean government to send her back to North Korea. And it has been even reported by lots of major medias around the world like CNN. But Korean government never listened and holding her until now. Based on the moral foundation of politics, what do you say about Kim Yanghee issue?
Well, I think there should be free movement. People should be able to go wherever they want. So why does the government not want her to go back?
Yeah, in South Korea, we have national security law. South Korean government said because of this law, Kim Yanghee can be sent back to North Korea. So I believe this national security law is in direct conflict with the value of democracy. So with the moral foundation of politics, would you evaluate the legitimacy of South Korean democracy that persists the national security law?
Well, you know, it's a long-standing principle of democratic theory that you can't pick and choose which laws you're going to obey, going all the way back to John Locke. John Locke says, we have a right to resist the government, but then we have to be willing to resist, you know, overthrow the government. And short of that, you have to obey the law. So if the law was enacted by a democratic government, you're not in a position to say that it was an illegitimate law. You have to try and get the law changed if you think that it's not that it's a bad law.
Thank you for the interview. Thank you for sharing your thoughts today. Thank
Okay.
you, Professor.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you.